Hello guys, welcome back to another video. I hope you're all doing well. Now Belgium is officially in a soft lockdown again, so all we are allowed to do is go out and walk a bit around or do some basic outdoor activities. So we decided the other day to visit the North Sea. Hope you enjoy a little bit of B-roll. So, you might be wondering what this video is all about. Well, I'm going to tell you today what the difference is between shooting your photos in RAW or shooting them in JPEG. So what is the difference and why should you pick any of the two? You can either take photos in RAW format by using your smartphone, your GoPro, a DSLR camera, a drone or any other camera. So what is it? Basically, whenever you press that shutter button of your camera, the camera starts to capture all information on the sensor. And that information is written down in one file. Well, basically whenever you choose to save the photo as a JPEG file, the camera will apply some basic post-processing in camera. For instance, it will compress the picture to a smaller size. Additionally, it will apply, for instance, some basic lens corrections or some basic color grading, but that's very limited and is typical for the camera itself. It's not something you can play around with. Now, for most photographers, this will be sufficient enough to post those photos on Instagram, and that's why most cameras are set to JPEG file by default. But whenever you're more serious into photography and you understand the power of shooting in RAW, you will probably choose to go with RAW files anyway. Whenever you choose to take a photo in a RAW file format, basically what your camera will do is capture all information and directly write all that information into one file. So it won't do any processing in the camera at all. And that's the big difference. Because with all that information, you can basically play around and you have way more freedom in post. Now, the biggest benefits of using RAW files is that you can bring in way more details later on. And whenever your photo is overexposed or underexposed, or you see some big problems regarding the lighting, then you can play around with it way more than with a JPEG file. And why is that? Basically because a JPEG file is a file that is compressed and all excess of information that's not needed to form that photo is deleted from the file. Whereas with a RAW photo, all information, even though it's not visible on your screen at first, is still inside that information of the RAW file. And that's why you can bring in details later on in post. This might sound a little bit technical, so I'm going to head over to Lightroom and show you a photo I took last week at the beach. It was very windy. You had these little trails of sand by the wind, and I really wanted to capture them with a long exposure. But as I didn't want to set up my DSLR because it's not weatherproof and sand is a really big enemy for camera sensors, I decided to just go with my smartphone and take the photo by hand. I shot it in RAW file and I selected in manual mode longer exposure time as normal. Now the problem by shooting during the day with long exposure is that your photo will be blown up, it will be overexposed. So instead of using ND filters, which I didn't have at all for my smartphone, I decided to use my sunglasses as a basic ND filter. but still the photo was overexposed, and that's why I shot it in RAW so I could bring back the details later on in post. And to show you that it's entirely possible to do this all for free, I did edit this same photo in Google Snapseed by using my smartphone only. You can see the RAW photo here, so you can see that edit over here. And now I'm going to head over to Lightroom. I'm still using an older version because I'm working on an older laptop. But one piece of advice, guys, never delete your photos in camera, even though they look really bad on your screen, because sometimes you can bring in those details so good and adjust the photo that well that it's maybe your best photo you took that day. So we're in Lightroom. Now, as you clearly can see, this is the overexposed photo I took with my smartphone, and I'm going to show you the edit from start to finish. So the end result might be a little bit different from the photo I did show you a few moments ago. Like always, I start by performing some basic lens corrections and color corrections as well. Next, I will go all the way up and start by performing some basic adjustments. Now you can always try by using automatic function, and you will clearly see it already does a beautiful job, but I prefer to not do that and just stick to the normal settings and do everything by hand. So let's start by decreasing the lightning to -2. You can see it already brings back a lot of details, and now I'm going to play with the contrast and with the highlights, shadows, whites and dark tones. Let's forget about contrast first and play around with the highlights. And now, as this photo is way too much overexposed, I will need to bring all sliders almost to the minimum settings. It's always easier to edit an underexposed photo than an overexposed photo, because a lot of detail and a lot of pixels are blown up when your shot is overexposed. Just keep in mind, if you ever have to choose between an overexposed or an underexposed shot, always try to underexpose your photos. Okay, so I will bring back the shadows. The whites, I'm not gonna touch the whites too much. And the blacks, we will decrease the blacks to about -80%. And you can clearly see the result is already pretty good. We already have a lot of details brought back. Now, you can play with the contrast as well. Normally, I decrease the contrast to around -20 to create this flat color profile. And then I adjust the colors manually. But this time I will have to increase the contrast to around, let's say, 20. And that's it for this part. Now I'm gonna play around with the clarity. Don't use the clarity too much. You can bring it all the way to 100%, but I prefer to give it a subtle effect. Let's say 10. Now what I always do to not over process my image is visually use the sliders, edit the photo, and then once I set to a certain value, I decrease the amount by a few percentage to avoid its over edits. But first, one thing that annoys me is that the horizon isn't flat. Normally I always start by correcting the horizon as well, but as you couldn't see the horizon that clearly, I first did some color grading. I first did some adjusting of the darks, of the highlights and the shadows. So I always use automatic function and then check whether it's good or not. As you clearly can see, now the horizon is perfectly flat. Okay, then you can always do your crop. For Instagram, that's 4:5. I always do the cropping in the beginning, because then you can adjust your edit based on the crop. No, then you can play around with the vibrance. I always decrease the vibrance again to create this flat color profile. And then later on in the HSL tab we can play around with the colors and bring back those colors we want to. And then the saturation, I slightly increase it to about 20%. Okay. The color curves. Curves are very powerful but often not used. By default, most people just apply a standard S-curve in the RGB channels, and that's what I'm gonna do as well. But you can do the same with the reds, the greens and the blue tones, and then you can play around. Let's bring, for instance, some more blue in the dark water, basically, because our beaches are sandy, the water is always brown, but I prefer a blue color tint in the ocean, so I'm going to apply a blue filter over the shadows. Then by the green tones, notice I always add 3 points, one for the mid-tones, one for the shadows and one for the highlights. Then you have one for the darks and one for the whites as well, but I don't use them always, only to create this moody effect. So let's bring in some purple. We'll add a little bit of green in the shadows. I'm not gonna touch the midtones too much, and then the highlights, let's leave them as they are as well. Now these edits are really subtle because you don't want to over process your image too much. So don't exaggerate with your edit. So the highlights are already pretty oversaturated with blue, so we're gonna correct for that later on. Alright. And that's about it for this part. And then we move to the HSL part. Now HSL sliders, you have 3 different things you can adjust. You have the color tone, the saturation and the luminance. And luminance is whether the color is light or dark, so you can play with the lights, the darks. Saturation is the intensity of the color. And then you have the color tone, you can play around with the color tint of a certain color. For instance, you can bring the reds more towards an orange tone, or you can bring the reds towards a more purple tone, like you can see here. So I'm not gonna touch the color tones too much now, but like I said, the blues are a bit too intense, especially in the clouds, so I'm gonna decrease that one by 50%. And then the beach could be a bit more orange and yellow, so I'm gonna bring in those tones, and I don't like purple or magenta in this photo, so I bring them all the way to -100%. And then you can play around with split toning. Split toning has changed in one of the latest updates of Lightroom in the new version, so this might be a little bit different. It's now with color wheels, but basically what it does is it adds a color of your choice. You can pick it with a color picker and adds that color to the highlights, and the other color you can pick is added to the shadows. So that way you can fine-tune your image even more, but again, don't exaggerate with it. So what I'm gonna do is bring in some orange, and what I mostly do is go all the way up, pick a color of my choice. This time I want to introduce orange, and then I use this slider to decrease the saturation because this effect has to be subtle. Same with the green, so I introduced a little bit of green in the sky. Yes, like that. It's quite a lot, but it's fine. Okay, now sharpening. Don't slide that slider all the way to the right, just add a little bit of sharpness to the shot, like only see white lines on the details I want to be sharpened. Otherwise you will sharpen the entire image and then the effect will be a bit too much. That way you only sharpen up the shadows a bit. Okay. Noise reduction, I won't do any noise reduction or any special noise reduction. I will only apply like 30% and move up the contrast a little bit, like this. You can apply some vignetting, but I don't like that too much. I will only give it, like many people always add a black vignette around their shot, but sometimes I try to add a white one, and that's mainly because white hides the vignetting of the lens. Okay, so then we can use the haze and dehaze function. Don't exaggerate with it, only give it that subtle look. And for this photo I prefer a little bit of whitewashed effect, so I'm going to add a bit of haze to the shot. And then you can play around with the camera calibration, and this can really help you to create a beautiful photo, but you play around with the colors as well. So that's a bit playing around. Okay, so that's the basic editing part. Now you can play around with masks, and I often use gradient masks to darken up the sky a little bit, but not too much. Always, like I said, slide the slider towards the position you want to, and then decrease the value a little bit to avoid it's over processed in the end, to avoid the photo is over processed in the end. Okay, so I'm gonna bring up the whites a little bit, and this photo is really quite blue. Increase the clarity, maybe like that. Okay, now the goal of this photo was to take a longer exposed shot and basically capture these sand trails created by the heavy winds. And maybe to emphasize that effect a little bit, I'm going to create another gradient filter and apply that to the sand only. And then by hitting Alt you can feather out the effect. So basically what Lightroom will do is it will apply until you see the black dot. It will apply the effect to that line, and then you have from that central line to the last line on the outside of the effect will fade out the effect. So the closer this line comes to the dot, the more harsh this effect will be. Okay, I'm going to create a bit more contrast on the beach. Now the highlights, let's increase those a little bit. Bring the shadows down if I can. Bring the black tones down a bit. Okay, like that. Minus 35 will be more than sufficient. And then add some clarity. And I think that should do it for this edit. So if we gonna check the before and the after, so that's the before edit and the after edit. And that's about it, guys, for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know down in the comments below what you want to see in future videos. Hit the thumbs up. If you didn't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell, and I hope to see you in the next one. Oh, and just remember, you don't need to be great to start, but start to become great.